Hello everyone, before we begin tonight's haunting tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the fear. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time the unknown feels closest to you. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let the whispers of the unknown guide you through the eerie corridors of our story. Ready to face the darkness? The Carpathian Mountains stretched endlessly into the horizon, their jagged peaks cloaked in mist and mystery. Known for their haunting beauty, this Romanian landscape was a realm of untouched wilderness, where ancient forests whispered secrets to the wind and shadows lingered long after the sun had set. Nestled high within this remote expanse was the Mountain Crest Hotel, a place shrouded in equal parts legend and infamy. Once a jewel of opulence and grandeur, the hotel now stood as a crumbling monument to a bygone era. Perched precariously on a cliffside, its Gothic architecture loomed like a spectre against the jagged skyline. Towering spires reached upward, their once gleaming surfaces dulled by decades of neglect. Vines crept along the stone walls, their tendrils twisting around gargoyle-like carvings that adorned the structure. Time had not been kind to the Mountain Crest Hotel, and yet, it retained an undeniable allure, a magnetism born of its history and the countless unanswered questions it held. The journey to the hotel was not for the faint of heart. A single, treacherous road wound its way through dense pine forests and steep mountain passes. The path was narrow, flanked by sheer drops on one side and towering cliffs on the other. As Sophia Davenport navigated the twisting route, her car's tires crunched over loose gravel, and the engine's hum seemed to echo into the abyss. She couldn't help but glance over her shoulder at intervals, as though expecting to see something or someone emerging from the shadows of the trees. Finally, the hotel came into view, emerging from the mist like a phantom. Sophia pulled the car to a stop at the base of the grand staircase leading to the entrance. The steps, carved from marble long ago, were cracked and worn, moss clinging to their edges. At the top stood the massive double doors, their ornate carvings faded but still intricate, depicting scenes of revelry and grandeur that felt hauntingly out of place. As Sophia climbed the steps, the air grew colder, and the wind carried an almost imperceptible whisper. It was easy to dismiss it as the rustling of leaves or the movement of air through the surrounding pines, but something about it made her pause. She tightened her grip on her bag, feeling the reassuring weight of her camera and notebook inside. The tools of her trade offered a small measure of comfort, but they did little to dispel the growing unease. The hotel's entrance hall was a cavernous space that spoke of former opulence. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystal prisms catching the weak light that filtered through the stained glass windows. Dust coated every surface, from the intricately carved reception desk to the faded velvet chairs that lined the walls. The air smelled of mildew and decay, but beneath it lingered a faint, unplaceable scent, something sweet and cloying, like the remnants of an old perfume. Sophia's footsteps echoed as she crossed the marble floor, her eyes scanning the room for signs of life. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her weight. It was as though the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The atmosphere was heavy, almost tangible, pressing against her chest and making it difficult to breathe. On one wall, a grand staircase spiraled upward, its balustrade an intricate lattice of wrought iron that had long since begun to rust. The steps were carpeted in what had once been a rich crimson but was now a dull, mottled brown. Above the staircase hung a massive painting, its subject a glamorous ballroom scene frozen in time. The figures in the painting seemed almost alive, their eyes glinting with an unsettling light as they stared down at Sophia. Despite the decay, there was an undeniable beauty to the Mountain Crest Hotel. Its ornate architecture and elaborate details hinted at a past when it had been a haven for the wealthy and powerful. The stories Sophia had read about its golden age painted a picture of extravagant parties, opulent feasts, and whispered scandals. Yet, those stories were overshadowed by the darker tales that had emerged in the decades since its closure. The locals spoke of guests who had vanished without a trace, their belongings left behind as though they had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. They whispered of strange lights flickering in the windows at night and the sound of laughter echoing through the empty halls. And then there was the legend of the Black Ball, a grand annual event that had ended in tragedy and was said to have marked the beginning of the hotel's decline. Sophia had heard these stories in the nearby village, where the residents had been all too eager to share their warnings. They had begged her not to go, their fear palpable as they described the hotel as a place that devoured those who dared to enter. But Sophia was not one to be swayed by superstition. She was here for a story, and she was determined to uncover the truth behind the legends. As she ventured deeper into the hotel, the sense of isolation grew. The walls seemed to close in around her, their faded wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint sound of dripping water from somewhere unseen. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind seemed amplified, echoing through the empty halls like a ghostly chorus. Sophia paused at the entrance to what had once been a grand dining hall. The massive space was filled with long tables covered in tattered white cloths, their surfaces littered with the remnants of long-forgotten meals. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals dull and covered in cobwebs. At the far end of the room, a massive fireplace loomed, its hearth cold and empty. Above it hung another painting, this one depicting a stern-looking man in formal attire. His eyes seemed to follow Sophia as she moved through the room, their gaze unnervingly lifelike. By the time Sophia returned to the entrance hall, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the floor. The stained glass windows transformed the fading light into a kaleidoscope of colors, painting the walls with patterns that shifted as the light dimmed. The beauty of the moment was not lost on Sophia, but neither was the growing sense of foreboding. Night was falling, and with it came the promise of the unknown. As she made her way up the grand staircase to find her room, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation was subtle but persistent, a prickling at the back of her neck that refused to be ignored. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the dimly lit hall below. It was empty, yet the feeling remained. Her room was small and sparsely furnished, its single window offering a view of the darkening mountains. The bed was covered in a faded quilt, and a single lamp cast a weak, flickering light. As Sophia set her bag down and began unpacking, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the hotel pressing down on her. It was a place steeped in history, its walls saturated with stories both told and untold. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Sophia knew she was only beginning to scratch the surface of the Mountain Crest Hotel's secrets. Sophia Davenport adjusted the strap of her leather satchel as she stepped out of her car and gazed up at the imposing facade of the Mountain Crest Hotel. A gust of wind swept through the cliffside, tangling her dark hair and sending a shiver down her spine. She tightened her coat around her, determined not to let the cold, or her nerves, get the better of her. Sophia had faced daunting assignments before, but something about this place felt different. It wasn't just the eerie grandeur of the building or the whispers of its dark past, it was the sense that the hotel itself was watching her. Sophia was not easily intimidated. At 32, she had carved out a name for herself as an ambitious and fearless journalist. Her career had taken her from war zones to corporate boardrooms, unraveling mysteries and exposing truths wherever she went. But the stakes of this assignment were more personal. Her editor had given her 3 days to produce a compelling story about the Mountain Crest Hotel, a story that could either catapult her career to new heights or leave her jobless in an industry that was becoming increasingly unforgiving. Sophia's career had always been her anchor. Growing up in a small town with little opportunity, she had learned early on that success required grit and determination. Her parents had encouraged her curiosity, but it was her late grandfather, a history professor with a penchant for ghost stories, who had truly sparked her fascination with uncovering the past. She still remembered sitting on his knee as a child, listening to his tales of forgotten places and the secrets they held. "Every story has a truth," he would say, "even the ones that seem impossible." Those words had stayed with her, shaping her approach to journalism. Sophia believed that even the most outlandish legends were rooted in something real, and it was her job to find that kernel of truth. It was this belief that had drawn her to the Mountain Crest Hotel. The tales of ghostly apparitions, vanished guests, and a cursed ballroom were enough to intrigue her, but it was the challenge of separating fact from fiction that truly excited her. As she pushed open the hotel's massive double doors, Sophia felt a mix of apprehension and exhilaration. She was stepping into the unknown, a place steeped in history and shrouded in mystery. Her notebook was already filled with preliminary research, accounts from locals who swore the hotel was cursed, old newspaper clippings about unexplained disappearances, and rumors of the infamous black ball that had marked the beginning of the hotel's decline. Sophia's plan was simple: gather evidence, document her experiences, and uncover the truth behind the Mountain Crest Hotel's dark reputation. She had brought along her trusted tools, a high-resolution camera, a voice recorder, and a notebook filled with questions. Each item was a weapon in her arsenal, a means of capturing the intangible and turning it into a story that would captivate her readers. But as prepared as she was, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment was different from any she had tackled before. There was an intensity to the hotel's silence, a weight to its air, that made her question whether she was hunting the story or whether the story was hunting her. Sophia's first interactions with the locals had been a mix of fascination and frustration. When she arrived in the nearby village a day earlier, she had expected resistance to her questions. Small towns often guarded their secrets closely. But the villagers' reactions had gone beyond mere reluctance. They had been afraid. An elderly woman selling pastries at the market had clutched Sophia's arm when she mentioned the hotel. "Don't go there," the woman had pleaded, her voice trembling. "That place is cursed. People go in, and they don't come out." Another man, a retired forester, had shaken his head at her inquiries. "There's no story worth your life," he had said, his tone grim. "Leave it alone." Despite their warnings, Sophia had pressed on. She had learned to navigate fear and skepticism in her line of work, and she knew that such strong reactions often meant there was something worth uncovering. Still, the villagers' fear had unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The drive up to the hotel had given Sophia plenty of time to reflect on her reasons for taking the assignment. Yes, she needed a story to keep her job, but it was more than that. The Mountain Crest Hotel represented a challenge, a chance to prove to herself and others that she could tackle even the most enigmatic mysteries. But it was also personal. Sophia had always been drawn to places where the past lingered, where the echoes of history whispered through the walls. This hotel, with its crumbling grandeur and dark legends, was a perfect storm of intrigue. As she settled into her room, a small but surprisingly well-preserved space on the second floor, Sophia couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. She unpacked her bag methodically, placing her camera and notebook on the desk and her recorder on the nightstand. The room itself was unremarkable: plain wallpaper, a creaky bed, and a single window overlooking the cliff, but it felt charged, as though it held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Sophia's thoughts turned to the stories she had collected during her research. There was the tale of a young couple who had checked into the hotel for their honeymoon, only to vanish without a trace. Their belongings had been found neatly packed, as though they had planned to leave, but the couple themselves had never been seen again. Then there was the legend of the Black Ball, a lavish annual event where the elite of the 1920s had gathered to celebrate in style. The ball had ended in tragedy one year, with the mysterious death of a prominent guest. Some said his spirit still roamed the hotel, seeking vengeance. Sophia had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but she couldn't deny the strange energy that seemed to permeate the hotel. As she sat at the desk, reviewing her notes, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the room's small mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw movement behind her, a flicker of shadow that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. She turned, her heart pounding, but the room was empty. Shaking off the momentary unease, Sophia focused on her plan for the next day. She would start with the guest book she had spotted at the reception desk, a dusty tome that seemed to hold decades of history within its pages. Then she would explore the hotel's library, where she hoped to find more information about its enigmatic owner and the events that had led to its closure. But as she turned off the light and lay down to sleep, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and the whispering wind outside seemed to carry voices she couldn't quite make out. She clutched her notebook tightly, her determination to uncover the truth battling against the growing sense of unease. For Sophia Davenport, the Mountain Crest Hotel was more than a story. It was a test of her courage, her resilience, and her belief that every legend held a kernel of truth. And as the shadows deepened and the whispers grew louder, she realized that this assignment would be the most challenging and the most personal of her career. The air inside the Mountain Crest Hotel felt heavier as night fell, the thick walls and high ceilings seeming to close in on Sophia Davenport. She had come to this place for a story, but the deeper she ventured into the hotel's eerie atmosphere, the more the stakes of her assignment crystallized. This was no ordinary feature for her editor, it was a last-ditch effort to salvage her career. Yet, as she delved into the mysteries of the hotel, she realized that her own survival might be at risk. Sophia's editor, Alistair Trent, had been both a mentor and a critic throughout her career. His faith in her abilities had landed her some of her biggest breaks, but his exacting standards left no room for mediocrity. "This story has to be groundbreaking," he had said during their last conversation, his voice carrying an edge that made it clear this was her final chance. "No fluff, no filler. I need a piece that grabs the reader by the throat and doesn't let go." Sophia had nodded, her confidence outwardly unshaken, but inside, she felt the weight of his words. Alistair had made it clear, if she failed to deliver, her position at the magazine would be terminated. In an industry increasingly driven by clickbait and shrinking budgets, journalists like Sophia, those who pursued in-depth, investigative stories, were becoming a dying breed. The pressure to produce something extraordinary was suffocating. Adding to her anxiety were the warnings from the locals she had spoken to earlier that week. The villagers' reluctance to discuss the Mountain Crest Hotel had been palpable, their eyes darting away whenever she mentioned the name. A young shopkeeper had been the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted a chilling story. "My cousin stayed there once," the girl had said, her hands trembling as she arranged jars on a shelf. "He thought it would be fun, a way to prove the legends weren't real. He came back different. He wouldn't talk about what happened, but he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. It was like something followed him home." Another villager, an elderly man who had lived in the area his entire life, had shaken his head when Sophia pressed him for details. "People vanish up there," he said, his tone heavy with resignation. "Sometimes they leave behind their belongings, but most of the time there's nothing. Just gone." Sophia had dismissed their warnings as superstition, the kind of stories small communities use to explain the unexplainable. But standing in the hotel's dimly lit hallway that night, she felt the first stirrings of doubt. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere above, and she froze, her heart pounding. The hotel was supposed to be abandoned, yet the sounds persisted, deliberate and rhythmic. She told herself it was the building settling, the wind playing tricks, but the logical explanations felt increasingly hollow. The stakes rose further when Sophia discovered the guest book at the reception desk. Dusty and weathered, the leather-bound tome seemed unassuming at first glance. But as she flipped through its pages, she noticed something unusual. The entries spanned decades, detailing the comings and goings of guests, but the handwriting in the later entries grew erratic. The final entry was dated June 5, 1987, and the words were scrawled in jagged letters, "He is here." Sophia stared at the page, her pulse quickening. The words felt like a warning, a message from someone who had seen something they couldn't comprehend. She snapped a photo of the page with her camera, her hands trembling as she tried to steady the lens. What had they seen? And more importantly, was it still here? Her doubts deepened the following day as she explored the hotel's library. The room was a treasure trove of history, its shelves lined with books that ranged from classic literature to obscure texts on folklore and the occult. Sophia's curiosity peaked when she discovered a bundle of old newspaper clippings tucked inside one of the books. The articles painted a grim picture of the hotel's past, guests who had disappeared without a trace, rumors of a curse tied to the property, and the sudden cancellation of the Black Ball after the mysterious death of a prominent attendee. One clipping, dated October 15, 1929, caught her attention. It described the death of Lord Alaric Hensley, a wealthy patron of the hotel who had been found dead in the ballroom during the height of the event. Witnesses claimed to have seen a shadowy figure near his body, but the official investigation concluded it was a tragic accident. The article ended with an ominous quote from one of the guests, "There was something in the air that night, something that didn't belong. I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes watching us." Sophia felt a chill run down her spine as she read the account. The connection between Lord Hensley's death and the strange occurrences in the hotel seemed undeniable. She jotted down notes in her journal, her mind racing with questions. Who or what had been watching that night? And was it the same presence that had terrified the villagers and written those cryptic words in the guest book? Her investigation took a dangerous turn when she decided to explore the restricted areas of the hotel. A locked door at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor caught her attention. The wood was old and splintered, deep claw marks gouged into its surface. An icy draft seeped through the cracks, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell that made her stomach churn. Sophia leaned in, pressing her ear to the door, and heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like breathing. Her instinct screamed at her to walk away, but her determination overruled her fear. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated but undeterred, she made a mental note to return with tools to force it open. Whatever lay beyond that door, she was certain it held the key to the hotel's mysteries. That night, a violent storm descended on the mountains, trapping Sophia in the hotel. The wind howled against the windows, and the lights flickered ominously. She sat in her room, reviewing the footage and recordings she had taken earlier in the day. As she played back a video of the library, something caught her attention. Amidst the creaking floorboards and rustling pages, a faint voice whispered, "Help me." Sophia froze, her eyes widening as she replayed the clip. The voice was unmistakable, yet she hadn't heard it during the recording. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what she had just heard, but the realization was inescapable. The hotel was trying to communicate with her. The storm raged on, and Sophia's unease grew. She had come here for a story, but now she wondered if she had ventured too far. The stakes were no longer just her career or her reputation, they were her safety, her sanity, and perhaps even her life. The Mountain Crest Hotel was not just a building, it was a living, breathing entity, and it had no intention of letting her leave unscathed. As the clock struck midnight, Sophia sat at her desk, staring at the guest book she had brought back to her room. The words "He is here" seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, a reminder of the danger lurking within the hotel's walls. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. If the Mountain Crest Hotel wanted to keep its secrets, it would have to fight her for them. Sophia closed her notebook and prepared for the next day. The villagers' warnings, the cryptic messages, and the storm's unrelenting fury all pointed to one thing: the hotel was not finished with her. And as much as she wanted to believe she was in control, a part of her knew the truth. The Mountain Crest Hotel held the upper hand, and it was only a matter of time before it revealed its full power. The first night in the Mountain Crest Hotel began innocuously enough. Sophia Davenport had settled into her modest room on the second floor, a space that felt both cramped and cavernous in its eerie silence. The dim glow of a single bedside lamp cast long shadows that flickered against the peeling wallpaper, while the howling wind outside provided an unsettling soundtrack to her thoughts. Yet, for all the room's imperfections, it felt safer than the rest of the hotel, and Sophia clung to that small comfort as she prepared for the night ahead. She sat at the desk, reviewing her notes and the photographs she had taken earlier that day. Her camera captured the haunting grandeur of the hotel, the faded elegance of its reception hall, the intricate carvings on its balustrades, and the ominous presence of the locked ballroom door. But as she flipped through the images, a strange pattern emerged. Faint, shadowy shapes in the background, too indistinct to identify but impossible to ignore. Sophia frowned, leaning closer to the screen of her camera. The shapes seemed to follow her path, appearing in corners and reflections, growing more defined with each shot. A chill ran down her spine as she realized they weren't artifacts of the camera or tricks of the light. Whatever they were watching her. Determined to distract herself, Sophia turned her attention to the guest book she had found at the reception desk earlier. The leather-bound tome was ancient, its pages yellowed and fragile. She flipped through it carefully, her eyes scanning the names and dates that spanned decades. Each entry was a snapshot of the hotel's history, a testament to the countless lives that had passed through its halls. But as she neared the final pages, the tone of the entries shifted. The handwriting grew more erratic, the words more fragmented. Mentions of strange occurrences and uneasy feelings appeared with increasing frequency. One entry, dated March 2nd, 1986, read, "We heard footsteps outside our door all night." When we opened it, no one was there. Another, from May 14, 1987, simply said, "The walls are whispering." Then came the final entry, scrawled in jagged letters, "He is here." Sophia stared at the words, her mind racing. Who was he? And why had the entries stopped so abruptly? She snapped a photo of the page, her pulse quickening as the weight of the guestbook's history settled over her. It wasn't just a record of visitors, it was a chronicle of the hotel's descent into darkness. The hours crept by, and the silence of the hotel grew heavier, almost oppressive. Sophia tried to focus on her research, but her concentration wavered as strange noises began to echo through the halls. At first, they were faint, a distant creak, a soft thud. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps, unmistakable and steady, paced back and forth outside her room. Sophia froze, her pen hovering over her notebook. The footsteps paused, then resumed, moving closer to her door. She held her breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped directly outside, and for a moment, all was silent. Then came a knock, soft, hesitant, yet undeniably real. Her heart pounded as she rose from the desk and approached the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound calm. There was no response. She waited, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally pulling it open. The hallway was empty. Sophia stepped into the corridor, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The flickering sconces cast long shadows that seemed to shift and dance as she moved. She walked a few steps, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing unusual. The air was cold, and she could feel the weight of the hotel pressing down on her, as if the building itself were watching her every move. As she turned to go back inside, a faint whisper reached her ears. It was indistinct, a soft murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sophia froze, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until she could make out a single word. "Stay." The voice sent a jolt of fear through her, and she hurried back into her room, slamming the door shut behind her. She locked it and leaned against the wood, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breathing. This wasn't her imagination, something was here, and it was trying to communicate with her. Desperate for answers, Sophia grabbed her voice recorder and began speaking into it. "It's 2:13 a.m., she said, her voice shaky but determined. "I've heard footsteps, knocking, and a voice." The word "stay" was clear, almost pleading. "I don't know what it means, but it felt directed at me." She set the recorder on the desk and replayed the audio. As her voice filled the room, she listened intently, hoping to catch something she had missed. And then it came, a faint, raspy whisper beneath her words. "Help me." The whisper was barely audible, but it was there. Sophia replayed the clip several times, her hands trembling as she adjusted the volume. Each time, the voice became clearer, its tone desperate and filled with anguish. It wasn't a demand, it was a plea. Sophia's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was hearing. Was it the voice of a guest who had vanished? A remnant of the hotel's tragic past? Or was it something else entirely, something that defied explanation? She felt a surge of adrenaline, her fear momentarily eclipsed by her determination to uncover the truth. The rest of the night passed in a haze of unease. Sophia stayed awake, her recorder running as she documented every sound and sensation. The footsteps returned periodically, pacing the hall outside her door, but she didn't dare investigate again. The whispers came and went, sometimes clear, sometimes barely perceptible. And through it all, the sense of being watched never left her. As dawn broke, the hotel's atmosphere seemed to shift. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, and the whispers faded into silence. Sophia sat by the window, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and watched as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the mountains. The beauty of the scene was starkly at odds with the night's events, a reminder of the strange duality of the Mountain Crest Hotel. Sophia knew she couldn't leave, not yet. The hotel held too many secrets, and she was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. But as she prepared for the day ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer just an observer. The hotel had noticed her, and it wasn't going to let her go easily. Her investigation was no longer just about finding a story, it was about survival. And as she reviewed her notes and recordings, one thought echoed in her mind. The Mountain Crest Hotel was alive, and it had chosen her as its next guest. As the sunlight spilled through the stained glass windows of the Mountain Crest Hotel, casting fragmented rainbows onto the walls, Sophia Davenport felt a faint glimmer of optimism. The events of the previous night had shaken her to her core, but the journalist in her refused to yield to fear. Whatever presence lingered in the hotel, whatever secrets it guarded, Sophia was determined to uncover them. After a quick breakfast of granola bars and coffee, supplies she had wisely packed given the lack of any functioning amenities, Sophia decided to start her day in the library. It was one of the few spaces she had glimpsed during her initial exploration that seemed largely untouched by decay. The tall shelves, laden with books of varying ages, stretched to the ceiling, while a rolling ladder hinted at a time when this room had been a hub of intellectual curiosity. Sophia approached the library with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The room exuded an almost magnetic pull, its dim lighting and hushed atmosphere enveloping her as she stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through a narrow window, and the faint scent of aged paper filled the air. For a moment, she felt a sense of calm, as though the library was a sanctuary from the oppressive energy that permeated the rest of the hotel. Her gaze scanned the spines of the books, noting titles that ranged from classic literature to obscure treatises on history and folklore. She ran her fingers along the shelves, pausing occasionally to pull out a book that caught her interest. Many of them bore the emblem of the hotel, a stylized crest with a mountain framed by elegant filigree, suggesting they had been commissioned specifically for the property. The thought struck her as odd. Why would a hotel, even one as grand as this, invest in its own line of books? Sophia's search led her to a corner of the library where a small table was tucked beneath a stained glass lamp. The light from the lamp cast an amber glow over the surface, illuminating a stack of newspapers and letters that appeared to have been abandoned mid-research. Intrigued, Sophia pulled out her camera and began documenting the scene before carefully examining the items. The first thing she noticed was the date on the topmost newspaper, October 15, 1929. The headline read, "Tragedy at the Mountain Crest Hotel, guest found dead during black ball." Sophia's breath caught as she skimmed the article, which detailed the mysterious death of Lord Alaric Hensley, a wealthy patron who had been attending the hotel's most prestigious annual event. According to the report, Lord Hensley had been found in the ballroom, his body surrounded by shattered glass and overturned furniture. Witnesses claimed to have seen a shadowy figure near the scene, but the official investigation had dismissed these accounts as hysteria. Sophia set the newspaper aside and reached for the letters beneath it. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as though the author had been writing in a state of distress. The first letter read, October 14, 1929. Dearest Eleanor, something is not right here. The staff are on edge, and I have heard whispers among the guests that make my blood run cold. Lord Hensley insists the ball must go on, but I fear we are tempting fate. There is an energy in this place, a heaviness that grows stronger with each passing hour. Please, pray for me. I feel as though we are being watched. Yours always, Julian. Sophia's hands trembled as she read the letter. The unease Julian described mirrored her own experiences in the hotel, and she couldn't ignore the parallels. She carefully photographed the letter before placing it back on the table. As she continued her search, Sophia discovered a journal tucked between two thick volumes on local history. The leather-bound book was worn, its edges frayed, but the writing inside was clear. The journal belonged to one of the hotel's former managers, a man named Victor Marlowe, who had overseen operations during its golden years. The entries began innocuously enough, detailing the daily challenges of running a luxury hotel, but they quickly took a darker turn. September 10, 1929. The preparations for the black ball are underway, but there have been incidents. Several staff members have reported seeing shadows where none should exist. One maid claimed she heard her name whispered in the empty ballroom. I dismissed her, of course, but her fear was palpable. September 25, 1929, Lord Hensley arrived today, bringing with him an air of arrogance and an entourage of sycophants. He insists on certain rituals being performed before the ball. When I questioned him, he merely smiled and said, "You'll understand soon enough." I do not trust him. October 16, 1929, the black ball is over, and the hotel will never be the same. Lord Hensley is dead, and the staff are fleeing. They speak of a curse, of shadows that stalk the halls. I have tried to maintain order, but the guests are leaving in droves. The hotel feels wrong. I cannot explain it, but I fear I will not be able to stay here much longer. Sophia felt a chill as she read Victor's words. The journal painted a picture of a hotel that had been teetering on the edge of something dark, its opulence masking an undercurrent of fear and despair. She couldn't help but wonder if Victor had ever managed to leave, or if he had become one of the countless souls claimed by the Mountain Crest Hotel. Determined to piece together the puzzle, Sophia turned her attention to the ballroom. The locked door she had discovered the previous day still loomed large in her mind, its claw-marked surface a stark reminder of the hotel's violent past. She decided to examine the surrounding area, hoping to find clues that might shed light on what had happened there. The hallway leading to the ballroom was lined with photographs of past events, their frames tarnished but intact. The images depicted scenes of lavish parties, guests in glittering attire, and tables laden with extravagant spreads. But as Sophia looked closer, she noticed something strange. In the background of several photos, there were figures that didn't belong, shadowy shapes that seemed to hover at the edges of the frame, watching. Sophia snapped photos of the photographs, her mind racing. The presence of these figures was undeniable, and their appearance in multiple images suggested they were not mere artifacts of age or damage. Whatever they were, they had been a part of the hotel's story for a long time. As the day wore on, Sophia felt the weight of the hotel's history pressing down on her. The evidence she had gathered pointed to a place that was not just haunted, but actively malevolent, a place that fed on the fears and weaknesses of those who dared to enter. Yet, despite the growing danger, Sophia couldn't bring herself to leave. The journalist in her was relentless, her need for answers eclipsing her fear. She returned to her room as twilight descended, her bag heavy with notes, photographs, and artifacts. The events of the day had provided her with a clearer picture of the Mountain Crest Hotel's past, but they had also raised new questions. What was the true nature of the shadowy presence that haunted the hotel? What had happened during the Black Ball to unleash such darkness? And, most importantly, why did it feel like the hotel was watching her, waiting for her next move? Sophia knew the answers wouldn't come easily. The Mountain Crest Hotel was a labyrinth of secrets, and she had only just begun to uncover its mysteries. But as she prepared for another night in its haunted halls, one thing was certain. The past was not done with her, and neither was the hotel. As twilight deepened over the Mountain Crest Hotel, the air seemed to grow thicker, charged with a subtle tension that prickled at Sophia Davenport's senses. Armed with the clues she had unearthed in the library, she resolved to confront the mysteries surrounding the locked ballroom. The claw-marked door and the stories of the Black Ball had become a fixation, their unanswered questions gnawing at her with every passing hour. Tonight, she would push past the threshold of her fear and the threshold of that ominous door. The hallway leading to the ballroom was eerily silent as Sophia approached, her flashlight casting a narrow beam of light that danced across the faded wallpaper. The photographs lining the walls, once vibrant displays of the hotel's glamorous past, now felt like ghosts themselves. The shadowy figures she had noticed earlier seemed to shift under her scrutiny, their forms indistinct but undeniably present. She tried to shake off the unease, focusing instead on the task at hand. The ballroom door loomed ahead, its surface scarred with deep grooves that suggested violence or desperation. Sophia placed a hand on the cool wood, hesitating as a chill crept up her spine. Her other hand tightened around the crowbar she had found in the maintenance closet, a crude tool, but one that filled her with a modicum of confidence. "I'm not leaving without answers," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. With a determined breath, Sophia wedged the crowbar into the gap between the door and its frame. The wood groaned in protest as she applied pressure, the sound echoing down the empty corridor. For a moment, she feared the noise might attract unwanted attention, but the oppressive silence of the hotel remained unbroken. Finally, with a sharp crack, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open. The air inside the ballroom was frigid, a stark contrast to the relative warmth of the hallway. Sophia stepped inside cautiously, her flashlight sweeping over the expansive space. The room was a decayed reflection of its former grandeur. Crystal chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, their once brilliant facets dulled by decades of dust. Ornate mirrors lined the walls, their surfaces tarnished and cracked, and the parquet floor, now warped and splintered, bore faint traces of what appeared to be burn marks. At the far end of the room stood a grand piano, its lid propped open as though waiting for a player. The sight of it filled Sophia with an inexplicable dread, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She approached it slowly, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. As she neared, she noticed something unusual, a faint shimmer in the air above the piano, like heat waves rising from asphalt. Sophia reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against the shimmer. A jolt of cold shot through her arm, and she recoiled, clutching her hand to her chest. The shimmer rippled and coalesced into a faint, ghostly figure, a woman in a flowing gown, her face obscured but her movements deliberate. The apparition seemed to be playing the piano, her hands gliding over invisible keys. Sophia froze, her breath hitching as the figure turned toward her. Though its face remained indistinct, the intensity of its gaze was palpable, as though it were looking directly into her soul. A low, mournful melody filled the room, the sound emanating from the piano despite its keys remaining untouched. "Who are you?" Sophia managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head as if considering her question, then dissolved into a swirl of light and shadow, leaving the room eerily silent once more. The encounter left Sophia shaken but resolute. She turned her attention to the rest of the ballroom, her flashlight revealing more signs of the room's violent history. Scattered across the floor were shards of glass, remnants of what must have been opulent chandeliers and champagne flutes. Burn marks radiated outward from a central point, where a large, circular stain marred the wood. Kneeling to examine it, Sophia realized the stain was not from spilled wine or water, it was darker, thicker. Blood. Her stomach churned as she pieced together the scene. Whatever had happened here during the Black Ball had ended in chaos and violence. The faint whispers she had heard the previous night seemed to echo in her ears now, fragments of conversations and screams blending into an incomprehensible cacophony. Sophia's investigation led her to a hidden alcove behind the stage. There, she discovered a series of old trunks, their leather surfaces cracked and worn. She opened the first one cautiously, finding it filled with yellowed documents and faded photographs. The images depicted scenes from the Black Ball, men and women dressed in extravagant attire, their faces frozen in expressions of laughter and revelry. But as Sophia flipped through the stack, she noticed a pattern. In every photograph, there was a single figure shrouded in shadow, its features obscured no matter the angle or lighting. One photograph in particular caught her attention. It showed a group of guests standing near the grand piano, their champagne glasses raised in a toast. The shadowy figure stood among them, its form almost blending into the background. But what made Sophia's blood run cold was the sight of a hand resting on the piano's keys, a hand that did not belong to any of the visible guests. Sophia placed the photograph in her bag and turned to the documents. They appeared to be invitations, menus, and seating charts from the Black Ball. One invitation, addressed to a Miss Eleanor Grayson, included a handwritten note. "Eleanor, you must attend. This will be a night to remember, one that will echo through eternity. Come alone. Lord Hensley insists." Sophia's mind raced as she connected the dots. Eleanor Grayson, mentioned in Julian's letter, had been a guest at the Black Ball. The note suggested she was more than a casual attendee. She had been invited personally by Lord Hensley, who seemed to play a central role in the night's events. But why had he insisted she come alone? And what had happened to her? The sound of a faint creak pulled Sophia from her thoughts. She turned sharply, her flashlight illuminating the alcove's entrance. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow flitting across the doorway, but when she stepped forward, the hallway beyond was empty. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the distant hum of the wind outside. Sophia returned to the ballroom, her nerves on edge. The room felt different now, heavier, as though it were aware of her presence. She approached the piano again, her fingers grazing the keys. They were cold to the touch, and when she pressed one, it produced a sound so discordant it made her wince. Yet, in the silence that followed, she thought she heard a faint voice whisper, "Why are you here?" Sophia's flashlight flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the beam returned, she saw the shimmer again, this time hovering above the blood-stained floor. The figure reappeared, its form more distinct than before. It pointed toward the stage, then vanished in a burst of light. Sophia's heart pounded as she approached the stage, her mind racing with questions. She climbed the steps and scanned the area, finding a trapdoor hidden beneath a tattered rug. With some effort, she pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air grew colder as Sophia descended, the faint smell of earth and decay growing stronger with each step. At the bottom, she found herself in a small, stone-walled chamber. In the center of the room was an altar, its surface covered in strange symbols carved into the stone. Candles, long since extinguished, surrounded the altar, their wax melted into grotesque shapes. Sophia's flashlight revealed more bloodstains, some smeared across the floor as though someone had been dragged. On the wall behind the altar, a phrase was scrawled in what appeared to be charcoal. Echoes never fade. The weight of the discovery pressed down on Sophia. This was no mere ballroom, it was a place of ritual, of sacrifice. Whatever had happened here during the Black Ball had unleashed something dark and insidious, something that still lingered within the hotel's walls. Sophia took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She had come seeking answers, but the truth she was uncovering was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The Mountain Crest Hotel was not just haunted by the past, it was trapped in it, and now, so was she. The Mountain Crest Hotel seemed to hold its breath as the night descended, shrouding its decaying halls in darkness. Sophia Davenport, though exhausted from her discoveries, felt a restless energy coursing through her veins. The ballroom and its hidden chamber had unveiled fragments of the truth, but they had also deepened the enigma surrounding the Black Ball and the sinister events tied to the hotel. Sophia couldn't ignore the lingering sense that the hotel was waiting for her next move, as if it had plans of its own. As the storm raged outside, thunder rumbling through the mountains, Sophia huddled in her room, poring over the artifacts and photographs she had collected. The phrase scrawled on the chamber wall, "Echoes never fade," reverberated in her mind, a chilling reminder of the hotel's refusal to let the past go. She studied the photograph of the shadowy figure at the piano, her fingers tracing its indistinct form. The image unsettled her, but it also ignited her determination to uncover the truth. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise. It was faint at first, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the floor below. Sophia froze, her pen hovering over her notebook. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, echoing through the otherwise silent hotel. Grabbing her flashlight and voice recorder, she stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding. The sound was leading her somewhere, beckoning her deeper into the hotel's labyrinthine corridors. Following the noise, Sophia found herself in a part of the hotel she hadn't explored before. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, its floral pattern barely visible beneath layers of grime. The floor creaked beneath her every step, the tapping sound growing louder as she approached a door at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and from within came a faint glow. Sophia hesitated, her instincts warning her to turn back, but curiosity won out. She pushed the door open, revealing a room filled with old recording equipment. Reel-to-reel tape machines and microphones were arranged in a semicircle, their surfaces covered in dust. In the center of the room stood a single chair, its upholstery torn and frayed. On the chair rested an open notebook, its pages filled with jagged handwriting. As Sophia approached, the tapping sound ceased, replaced by the soft hum of static. She picked up the notebook, her eyes scanning the chaotic text. Most of the words were indecipherable, scrawled in a frantic hand, but one sentence stood out. "The echoes are alive." Before Sophia could process the meaning of the phrase, the static grew louder, and one of the tape machines whirred to life. The reels spun, and a voice crackled through the speakers. It was faint and distorted, but the words were clear. "Leave this place." Sophia's pulse quickened as the voice repeated the command, growing more urgent with each iteration. She fumbled for her recorder, capturing the sound as the static surged, filling the room with a deafening roar. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was almost more unnerving, the air heavy with an unspoken warning. Sophia backed away from the equipment, her flashlight casting erratic beams of light across the room. She turned to leave, but as she reached the door, a shadow moved in her peripheral vision. Spinning around, she saw it, a figure standing in the corner, its form obscured by darkness. Its presence was palpable, radiating a sense of malevolence that made her stomach churn. "Who are you?" Sophia demanded, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the notebook on the chair. Then, like a wisp of smoke, it vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of burning wood. Sophia returned to her room, her mind racing. The encounter had left her shaken, but it had also provided her with a new lead. The notebook's cryptic message and the strange activity in the recording room hinted at something deeper, a connection between the echoes of the past and the hotel's current state. She flipped through the notebook again, searching for anything she might have missed. Amid the chaotic writing, she found a rough sketch of a symbol, an eye encircled by flames. The symbol triggered a memory. She had seen it before, carved into the altar in the hidden chamber beneath the ballroom. The connection was undeniable, but what did it mean? Sophia reached for her laptop, searching for references to similar symbols in folklore and occult history. Her search yielded a chilling discovery. The symbol was associated with a ritual meant to bind spirits to a location, trapping them in a perpetual state of torment. Sophia's research was interrupted by a sudden crash outside her door. She jumped, her heart racing as she grabbed her flashlight and cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty, but a broken vase lay shattered on the floor, its pieces arranged in a deliberate pattern. Sophia knelt to examine it, realizing the shards formed the same iron flame symbol she had just been researching. A cold breeze swept through the corridor, extinguishing her flashlight's beam. Panic surged through her as she fumbled to turn it back on, but when the light returned, the shards were gone, and the hallway was pristine. Sophia stumbled back into her room, locking the door behind her. She leaned against it, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. The hotel wasn't just haunted, it was alive, responding to her every move. The storm outside the Mountain Crest Hotel intensified as night fell, the wind howling like a chorus of spectral voices. Sophia Davenport stood in the ballroom, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The room felt different tonight, charged with an energy that was both magnetic and menacing. The ghostly piano music had returned, faint and fragmented, as though played by a long-dead musician. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something sweeter, almost cloying, that Sophia couldn't place. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, her resolve hardening. Tonight, she would face the heart of the hotel's darkness. The grand piano dominated the center of the ballroom, its polished surface gleaming despite the layers of dust that covered everything else. The lid was open, and the keys moved of their own accord, producing a haunting melody that seemed to seep into Sophia's bones. Around the piano, spectral figures began to materialize, their forms faint and flickering. They were dressed in 1920s attire, silk gowns, tuxedos, and jewelry that sparkled with an otherworldly light. Their faces, however, were obscured, as though the shadows of the room had claimed them. Sophia watched in stunned silence as the figures began to dance, their movements fluid yet mechanical, like marionettes on invisible strings. The atmosphere in the room shifted, growing heavier with each passing moment. It was as if the hotel itself were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to take center stage. Then, it happened. The shadows in the room coalesced into a single figure at the far end of the ballroom. It was tall and imposing, its form draped in darkness that seemed to ripple like smoke. Where its face should have been, there was only a void, but its presence was unmistakably malevolent. The figure raised an arm, and the ghostly dancers froze mid-step, their heads turning in unison to face Sophia. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Sophia's breath formed icy clouds in the air. She felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but her legs refused to move. The figure began to glide toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. The walls stretching and bending like a funhouse mirror. "Why have you come?" the figure's voice boomed, echoing off the walls. It was deep and resonant, carrying a weight that pressed down on Sophia's chest. She struggled to speak, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I want to know the truth," she said, clutching her flashlight like a talisman. The figure paused, tilting its head as if considering her words. The ghostly dancers began to move again, their steps growing faster and more erratic. The piano music shifted to a frantic, discordant tempo, the notes clashing in a way that set Sophia's nerves on edge. "The truth comes at a price," the figure intoned. "Are you prepared to pay it?" Sophia's grip on the flashlight tightened. "I am," she said, her voice steadier now. "Whatever it takes." The figure extended an arm, and the shadows in the room surged toward Sophia, enveloping her in darkness. She felt a sudden rush of cold, as though she had been plunged into icy water. For a moment, she couldn't see or hear anything but the pounding of her own heart. Then, the darkness began to lift, revealing a scene that was both familiar and alien. She was no longer in the decayed ballroom but in a pristine version of it, as it must have appeared during its heyday. The chandeliers sparkled with golden light, the mirrors reflected jubilant faces, and the air buzzed with laughter and music. Sophia realized she was witnessing the Black Ball, the event that had marked the beginning of the hotel's downfall. Sophia moved through the crowd, her presence unnoticed by the guests. She saw them toasting with champagne, their conversations filled with gossip and intrigue. At the center of it all stood Lord Alaric Hensley, the man whose death had become the stuff of legend. He was tall and charismatic, his every movement commanding attention. But as Sophia watched him, she noticed something off. His eyes darted around the room, his smile strained. He was nervous, perhaps even afraid. The scene shifted suddenly, the laughter and music fading into an eerie silence. The guests froze in place, their faces contorted in expressions of fear. Lord Hensley turned toward the grand piano, where the shadowy figure now stood. The air grew heavy, and Sophia felt a sense of impending doom as the figure raised its arms. The chandeliers flickered, and the mirrors began to crack, the fractures spreading like spiderwebs. "You cannot escape," the figure said, its voice echoing through the ballroom. Lord Hensley stepped back, his composure unraveling. He shouted something, but his words were drowned out by the sound of shattering glass. The figure advanced on him, and the scene dissolved into chaos. Sophia was yanked back into the present, the pristine ballroom replaced by the decayed version she had come to know. The ghostly dancers had vanished, and the shadowy figure stood once again at the far end of the room. It pointed at her, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You have seen," it said. "Now you must choose." Sophia didn't understand what it meant, but she didn't have time to ask. The figure lunged toward her, its form expanding to fill the entire room. Shadows swirled around her, and she felt herself being pulled toward the grand piano. The keys began to play on their own, producing a melody that was both beautiful and haunting. Sophia reached for the piano, her hand brushing against its cold surface, and a surge of energy shot through her. Visions flooded her mind, Lord Hensley conducting a ritual, the guests being drawn into it against their will, and the figure emerging from the darkness to claim them. The Black Ball had been no mere party, it had been a sacrifice, a binding spell gone horribly wrong. The hotel had become a prison for the souls trapped in that moment, their echoes replaying the tragedy over and over. Sophia pulled her hand away, gasping for air. The figure loomed over her, its voice a deafening roar. "Break the cycle," it commanded. "Or join us." Sophia knew what she had to do. The fragments of the mirror, the symbols in the chamber, the rose on the piano, they were pieces of a puzzle, clues left behind to guide her. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small, intricately carved box she had found earlier. Inside was the mirror fragment, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. Holding the fragment up to the figure, Sophia shouted, "I see you." The shadows recoiled, and the figure let out a guttural scream. The mirror fragment began to glow, its light spreading through the room like a fire. The walls of the ballroom shuddered, the chandeliers crashing to the floor as the hotel itself seemed to resist the purification. The figure lunged at Sophia, but she held her ground, the mirror fragment shielding her like a barrier. "You can't control me," she said, her voice firm. "I'll finish what they couldn't." The light from the mirror intensified, and the figure began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like ash in the wind. The shadows retreated, and the oppressive weight in the room lifted. For the first time, the hotel felt still. Sophia collapsed to her knees, the mirror fragment clutched tightly in her hand. She had faced the heart of the Mountain Crest Hotel's darkness and survived, but she knew the confrontation was far from over. The cycle had been disrupted, but the echoes of the past still lingered, waiting for the next move. The oppressive silence that followed Sophia's confrontation in the ballroom was short-lived. As she clutched the mirror fragment, the weight of her victory began to dissipate, replaced by a chilling realization: the hotel was not going to let her leave without a final challenge. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows that had once recoiled now crept back, encircling her like predators waiting to strike. Sophia staggered to her feet, her breathing ragged as she scanned the room. The grand piano, now silent, seemed to loom larger than before, its surface cracked and distorted as though the hotel itself were warping around her. She stuffed the mirror fragment into her satchel and tightened the strap across her chest, her instincts screaming at her to run. "Leave now," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Before it's too late." But the hotel had other plans. The moment Sophia stepped into the hallway, the door to the ballroom slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The lights flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that writhed and twisted like living things. The once familiar corridor now seemed endless, its walls narrowing and shifting as though the hotel were alive, determined to trap her within its labyrinth. Sophia forced herself to move, her footsteps echoing unnaturally as she sprinted toward the staircase. The floor beneath her feet groaned in protest, the wood splintering as if trying to swallow her whole. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the shadows gathering, a tide of darkness surging after her. Their form was not solid but shifting, filled with spectral faces that screamed silently, their mouths stretched impossibly wide. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into near-total darkness. Panic clawed at her chest, but she kept running, relying on her memory of the layout to guide her. The faint glow of the storm outside provided intermittent flashes of light, illuminating glimpses of the hallway, a broken mirror, a toppled vase, claw marks gouged into the walls. Each flash seemed to bring the shadows closer, their advance relentless. Sophia reached the staircase and gripped the banister, her fingers numb from the cold. She descended quickly, her boots thudding against the steps as the building shuddered around her. The storm outside howled louder, the wind rattling the windows as though the very elements were conspiring against her escape. As she reached the ground floor, the lobby came into view. It was a grotesque parody of its former grandeur, the chandeliers swinging violently overhead and the floor littered with debris. The front doors, her only means of escape, were barely visible through the swirling shadows that filled the space. But she could see them, just ahead, a beacon of hope in the chaos. Sophia sprinted toward the doors, her heart pounding in her ears. She reached for the handle, but the moment her fingers brushed the metal, the shadows surged forward, slamming into her like a tidal wave. She was thrown backward, her body colliding with the reception desk. Pain flared through her ribs as she hit the ground, but she forced herself to her feet, clutching the edge of the desk for support. The shadows coalesced into a single form, towering and amorphous, its edges flickering like fire. Within its depths, Sophia could see countless faces, guests, staff, and perhaps even the lost souls of the Black Ball. Their expressions were a mix of terror and despair, their eyes pleading with her as though begging for release. "You cannot leave," the figure intoned, its voice a guttural growl that reverberated through the room. "You belong to the echoes now." Sophia shook her head, defiance flaring within her. "I don't belong to anything," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "This ends tonight." The figure laughed, a sound that was both cruel and hollow. "You think you can break the cycle? You are nothing but a pawn in a game you cannot comprehend." Sophia's gaze darted around the room, searching for anything she could use to gain the upper hand. Her eyes landed on the reception desk and the stack of old keys that sat atop it. An idea began to form, spurred by the fragments of lore she had uncovered. The keys were tied to the rooms, and the rooms were tied to the guests, the echoes that haunted the hotel. She grabbed the keys and began tossing them into the shadows, each one glowing faintly as it left her hand. The shadows recoiled with each impact, the faces within them momentarily flickering out of existence. The figure roared in anger, its form wavering as the light from the keys grew brighter. "Stop," it bellowed, its voice cracking with desperation. "You don't understand what you're doing." But Sophia didn't stop. She hurled the keys one by one, her movements frantic yet deliberate. With each key, the shadows diminished, their hold on the room weakening. The figure began to shrink, its once imposing presence reduced to a flickering mass of darkness. The final key glowed brighter than the rest, its light piercing through the gloom like a blade. Sophia clutched it tightly, feeling its warmth seep into her skin. She stepped forward, her resolve unshakable, and thrust the key toward the figure's core. The light exploded outward, consuming the shadows in a blinding flash. When the light faded, the lobby was silent. The storm outside had calmed, the wind reduced to a gentle whisper. The oppressive weight that had hung over the hotel was gone, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Sophia stood alone, the broken keys scattered at her feet. Her chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. The front doors creaked open, revealing the night beyond. The moonlight spilled into the lobby, illuminating the remnants of the battle. Sophia hesitated, her hand hovering over the threshold. She felt the hotel's presence lingering, not malevolent but watchful, as though it were acknowledging her triumph. "You can't keep me here," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of defiance and gratitude. "Not anymore." With that, she stepped into the night, the cool air wrapping around her like a balm. The hotel stood silent behind her, its dark windows reflecting the starlit sky. For the first time, it felt like a place at rest, its echoes finally fading into the past. Sophia walked away, her steps slow but purposeful. The mirror fragment in her satchel pulsed faintly, a reminder of the battle she had fought and the secrets she had uncovered. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. The Mountain Crest Hotel had let her go, but its story was far from over. The night outside the Mountain Crest Hotel was still, the storm having abated after Sophia's desperate fight for escape. Yet inside the hotel, the air remained heavy, thick with anticipation. Sophia stood in the lobby, her chest heaving as she tried to gather her thoughts. The fragmented mirror in her satchel pulsed faintly, its glow a reminder that her battle was far from over. The hotel might have relented for a moment, but it wasn't finished with her. The faint whisper of voices began to build, echoing through the cavernous lobby. The sound was hauntingly melodic, like a choir singing a hymn in a language she couldn't understand. Sophia turned toward the ballroom, where the shadows still lingered, though their once menacing presence seemed subdued. They no longer surged toward her but hung in the air like smoke, watching, waiting. She tightened her grip on the mirror fragment, its cold edges digging into her palm. The fragment felt alive, resonating with an energy that both frightened and emboldened her. It was a piece of the curse, tied to the rituals and sacrifices that had ensnared the hotel in its eternal torment. If she could unlock its secrets, she might finally free the souls trapped within the walls. Sophia stepped back into the ballroom, her boots crunching against the broken glass and debris scattered across the floor. The grand piano loomed in the center of the room, its keys silent but glinting in the dim light. As she approached, she noticed a faint shimmer above the piano, an image of the past, flickering like a broken film reel. It showed Lord Alaric Hensley standing at the piano, his face twisted in a mask of fear and defiance. In the vision, Hensley raised his hands, chanting in a deep, commanding voice. The guests around him were frozen in place, their faces pale and lifeless as if they were caught between worlds. The shadows surged toward him, drawn to his voice, but the image abruptly faded, leaving Sophia with more questions than answers. The altar in the hidden chamber beneath the ballroom called to her. She descended the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The chamber was as she had left it, the carvings on the walls glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The phrase "echoes never fade" seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though the words were aware of her presence. Sophia placed the mirror fragment on the altar, its glow intensifying as it connected with the carvings. The room vibrated with a low hum, and the shadows in the corners of the chamber began to coalesce, forming into the same towering figure she had confronted before. Its form flickered between solid and insubstantial, its voice a mix of anger and sorrow. "You should have left when you had the chance," it growled, its words echoing through the chamber. "The curse binds us all. There is no escape." Sophia met its gaze, her fear replaced by determination. "There's always a way. You're bound here." But I'm not. And I'm going to end this. She reached into her satchel and retrieved the items she had collected, the rose from the piano, the sketch of the iron flame symbol, and the final key she had found in the recording room. Each item seemed to resonate with the mirror fragment, their energies intertwining in a way that sent ripples through the air. Sophia realized they were pieces of a ritual, a way to undo what had been done so many years ago. Clara Greyfeather's warning echoed in her mind: the curse feeds on greed, on despair. You must confront it, but you must also acknowledge it. Only then can it be broken. Sophia arranged the items on the altar, her hands trembling as she aligned them with the carved symbols. The mirror fragment glowed brighter, casting shifting patterns of light across the walls. The shadows roared, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of anger and fear. The figure stepped closer, its presence oppressive. You think you can undo centuries of pain with a few trinkets? You are a fool. Sophia ignored the taunt, focusing on the words inscribed in the journal she had found. They were part of the ritual, a chant meant to cleanse and release the trapped souls. She began to recite the words, her voice steady despite the growing intensity of the shadows around her. As she chanted, the room shook violently, the carvings on the walls glowing brighter with each syllable. The shadows writhed, their forms disintegrating as the light from the mirror fragment spread outward. The figure let out a deafening scream, its form flickering as it tried to resist the pull of the ritual. Sophia continued, her voice rising above the chaos. By the light of truth, by the bond of what was broken, I release you. I release you all. The mirror fragment shattered, its light erupting in a blinding flash that filled the chamber. The shadows were consumed by the light, their screams fading into silence. The figure dissolved, its final words a whispered plea: remember us. When the light faded, the chamber was still. The oppressive energy that had filled the hotel was gone, replaced by a profound silence. Sophia collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. The items on the altar had disintegrated, their purpose fulfilled. She made her way back to the lobby, her steps slow and deliberate. The hotel felt different now, lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. The chandeliers no longer swayed, the mirrors no longer reflected distorted images. It was as if the hotel had been freed from its own nightmare. The front doors stood open, inviting her to leave. Sophia stepped outside, the cool night air a welcome relief. She turned back to look at the hotel one last time, its dark windows now reflecting the moonlight. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a man in a tuxedo, his expression one of gratitude. Then he was gone, and the hotel stood silent. As Sophia walked away, the fragments of her journey replayed in her mind. The mirror, the rose, the journal, all pieces of a puzzle that had tested her courage and resolve. She had come to the Mountain Crest Hotel seeking a story, but she had found something far greater, a chance to bring peace to a place that had known only suffering. The echoes were finally fading, but Sophia knew the memories would stay with her forever. The Mountain Crest Hotel had changed her, just as she had changed it. And as she disappeared into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that its story wasn't truly over. The echoes never fade, they just wait to be heard again. The cool night air enveloped Sophia as she stepped out of the Mountain Crest Hotel, its oppressive hold finally lifted. The storm had passed, leaving the night calm and eerily quiet. She turned back to look at the grand structure, its silhouette outlined by the soft glow of the moon. For the first time, the hotel seemed at peace, its dark windows no longer watching her but simply existing, like a sentinel freed from its eternal vigil. Sophia's legs trembled as she made her way down the gravel path leading away from the hotel. Her satchel, lighter now with the destruction of the mirror fragment, swung at her side. The weight in her heart, however, was heavier than ever. She had won the battle, but the echoes of what she had seen, the suffering, the despair, the countless lives lost to the hotel's curse, lingered within her. As she reached the edge of the forest, Sophia paused to catch her breath. She looked back one final time, her mind replaying the events that had led her here. The ballroom, the shadows, the altar, all of it seemed surreal, like a dream she couldn't quite wake from. Yet the ache in her muscles and the faint burn of her cuts reminded her that it was all too real. The faint sound of the wind rustling through the trees brought her back to the present. She had survived. That alone was a victory. Back in her apartment, the morning sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the room in warmth. Sophia sat at her desk, her laptop open, and her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The blinking cursor seemed to taunt her, a reminder of the task ahead. She had a story to tell, one that would captivate her audience and cement her reputation as a journalist. But how could she put into words what she had experienced? How could she convey the terror and beauty of the Mountain Crest Hotel without sounding unhinged? She glanced at the small box on her desk. Inside were the remnants of her journey, the rose from the piano, a photograph of the ballroom before its decay, and the journal she had found in the hidden chamber. These items were her proof, her connection to the truth. But they were also a reminder of the weight she now carried. Sophia began to type, her words flowing hesitantly at first but gaining momentum as she relived the story. She described the hotel's grandeur, its haunting presence, and the way it seemed to breathe with a life of its own. She recounted the echoes of the past, the shadows that had pursued her, and the moment she had broken the curse. Her fingers trembled as she wrote about the souls she had seen, the guests, the staff, even Lord Hensley himself. She didn't shy away from the horror, but she also highlighted the humanity, the longing for peace that had driven her to risk everything. As the day turned to night, Sophia finished her article. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. The words on the screen were raw and unfiltered, but they were honest. This was her truth, and she was ready to share it. Yet, as she prepared to hit publish, a thought nagged at the back of her mind. Would revealing the hotel's secrets bring peace to the souls trapped there, or would it invite more danger? Sophia hesitated, her finger hovering over the mouse. The hotel had let her go, but at what cost? She thought of Clara Greyfeather's warning, some stories are not meant to be told. The Mountain Crest Hotel's story was one of pain and redemption, a delicate balance that could easily tip back into chaos if disturbed. In the end, Sophia made a choice. She saved the article but didn't publish it. Instead, she printed a copy and placed it in a file marked "For My Eyes Only." The world didn't need to know the hotel's truth, not yet, at least. For now, it was enough that she knew. Weeks passed, and life began to return to normal. Sophia resumed her work, taking on assignments that seemed mundane compared to her time at the Mountain Crest Hotel. Yet, the experience had changed her. She found herself more attuned to the world's subtleties, the whispers of history in old buildings, the stories hidden in forgotten places. She became a seeker, not just of news but of truths that lay beneath the surface. One evening, as she sat in her living room with a cup of tea, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "A reminder." Sophia's heart raced as she opened it. The email contained a single image, a photograph of the Mountain Crest Hotel, taken from the same angle as the one she had captured on her way out. But in this image, the front doors were slightly ajar, and a faint light glowed from within. Sophia stared at the screen, her mind racing. The hotel was still watching, still waiting. She closed the email and set her phone aside, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and curiosity. The echoes might have faded, but they hadn't disappeared. They were still there, lingering in the shadows, waiting to be heard again. Sophia returned to the Mountain Crest Hotel once in her dreams. The ballroom was whole again, the chandeliers casting golden light over the dancers who moved with a grace that seemed otherworldly. She stood at the edge of the room, watching as the shadows and the light intertwined, neither dominating the other. A figure approached her, a man in a tuxedo, his face kind but sad. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You've given us a chance to rest." Sophia woke with tears in her eyes, the weight of the dream pressing down on her. She didn't know if she would ever return to the hotel in person, but she knew it would always be a part of her. The Mountain Crest Hotel had changed her, and in doing so, it had become a part of her story. The echoes never fade, not entirely. But sometimes, they can be quieted. Sometimes, they can find peace. And sometimes, they can teach us to listen.